infrastructure services, providing water and sanitation services, services to people who don't have them, providing energy and energy services, including clean cooking, to women and families who do not have them. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I did just want to kick off with those couple of simple points. And those are actions that are not, in the adaptation community, haven't fundamentally been labeled adaptation policies, but they are pro-poor development policies that have adaptation co-benefits.
Thank you, Jan, for giving us the opening lines and opening thoughts. Jan, should I turn to you to give us a sense of how do you see this, the state of play?
You know, I spent about 7 years of my life as a climate negotiator. Climate negotiators are not saber-toothed tiger like the trade negotiators. Trade negotiators are the tough one, but we were not meek lambs either. You know, a negotiator, his hope is that whatever point he's making on behalf of his country or the group of countries, everybody will accept. His fear is that am I being taken for a ride? Is there a catch somewhere? And 4 years after I left negotiation, and the way, I mean, even the title of this, how to make adaptation bankable. So I thought to myself, oh my God, is that the shape of things to come? Adaptation to climate change is not an issue like circular economy or air pollution and all, which we discuss. Climate change is an externality, and it is a big, okay, let me censor myself. It's a big externality to poor countries, whether in Africa or in South Asia. And it is not due to any doings of theirs. That having been said, climate change is governed by a treaty regime which is binding. And it was binding because a large number of developing countries and a large number of developed countries, EU group was one of them, wanted it to be binding. And now we are talking, when we talk of adaptation, we are talking of bankability and resilience and such like things to an external threat. To my mind, what Prime Minister Indira Gandhi said in Stockholm in 1972 still holds valid. What she said then was, poverty is the worst form of pollution. And the basic adaptation, to my mind, is not building climate resilient infrastructure and so on and so forth. Basic adaptation is eradication of poverty. Yesterday I heard 3 times people talking of poverty alleviation. Will the poor be always with us? Will there always be rich and poor? Yes, there will always be rich and poor. But the extreme poverty, which SDG 1 talks of, having a roof on your head, having 2 changes of clothes, not having to worry about how many times you're going to eat in a day, the extreme poverty needs to be eradicated. And if that is done, the society by itself would be resilient to the climate change impacts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jayant. John, I will turn to you. You've been looking at Africa very closely on financing and resilience. What's the state of play here? How do you see it?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I'm proud and Rwandan. I'm in my home country, and then I'm African. So from the World Bank perspective, I would focus on Africa as a continent, and then I use a case study of East African, practical demonstration case for Rwanda. For Africa, you see the climate change, the action, the cost is high. And then the World Bank has been funding public investment. With the climate change as a cross-cutting, you could see the sectors are really suffering. If for the case of the GDP loss, you could see maybe 10%, some climate change, flooding. And when it comes for the funding, the government are more increasing the funding, but you could see there is limited fund. If you go to the public investment, what you say, the infrastructure, we have a key sectors, agriculture, education, health. You could realize that the government could not release a lot of money for the climate change action. So with the World Bank is coming up with the new approaches, they created now new financial instruments. You will see the World Bank launched now the coalition of Minister of Finance in spring meeting, that was April, where the Minister of Finance will come in to discuss specifically on climate change action through the fiscal policy and the public finance. This is one of the proposed solutions to deal with resilient project. How do we support the public sector to be resilient from the infrastructure, from the energy, education, health, and agriculture? How do we sustain global food security, then continental security? The food would be one of the primary targets. With the World Bank innovative approach now, list a number of new financial instruments where the World Bank now is supporting a specific government. In Africa, they come up with proposal, how could we have a resilience bonds through the green bonds? How do we decentralize from the top countries to the decentralized entity where they have municipal bond? Those are the new financial instruments coming up now. Of course, to achieve that, you could have a good proposal if you don't have finance to implement. The implementation is one of the key challenges you realize. You could come with a good proposal, then how would you implement it? That's what is happening now to call deep dive. That's the approach the World Bank is using, selecting key countries to key regional economic bloc from West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, Southern African countries. They selected 8 countries for each. They did each economic bloc, 2 countries. In East Africa, Kenya and Rwanda were selected. They deep dive. And now they started doing the study, what I call feasibility studies, to inform policymakers how they deal with the climate change issues. A number of studies are now undertaking, and then they will come up informing the policymakers, and then they would try to support from business, private sector, civil society organization, to support the public sector, meaning the government, how to deal with the climate action. A number of the new financial instruments could come up with resilient bond, forest bond, water bond, and then they have incubation for businesses. Then they would have with the piloted, demonstrated cases where they could really deal with the climate change actions. Maybe I would have elaborated in the next talk.
Thank you, John. Kira, straight to you.
Thank you, Jaydeep. So just to give a bit of a backdrop about what we are actually talking about, we're currently exiting the Holocene. So the time period in which humans became settled, in which the Neolithic revolution happened, was a time period of strong climatic stability. And now we're entering into the Anthropocene, where human beings, human activity shapes the Earth system in quite dramatic ways, as we see, and in which the current generation determines the climate stability for the next generations to come, for thousands of years to come. And we're already at 1 degree above pre-industrial temperatures, and we see and have observed across all continents and the oceans the effects of this. Where are we going? What are we actually adapting to? The good news is that we have the Paris Agreement. So we know what is the temperature sort of pathway, 1.5 to 2 degrees, that human civilization will have to adapt to. So this is the good news. However, this is only in theory the case, because in many regions that are particularly exposed to climate impacts, such as sub-Saharan Africa, also parts of Asia, we don't have strong regional climate science. So we don't really know what the effects of this temperature increase will be. But we have seen that already at 1 degree, the effects are tremendous. We've seen extreme tropical cyclones, droughts, floods, etc., and sea level rise. So we need to strengthen the capacities at the regional level so that countries will be able to produce their own science on this, so that they know what to adapt to, really. And for example, this is quite complicated. I looked it up before. It's only across Africa, there are only 300 weather stations that feed into the World Meteorological Information Base. In my country, Germany, which is a very, very small country, there's 200 stations. And why does this matter? Well, it matters for short-term forecasting, but it's also very important to make climate projections. You need good data that extends long back into time. And for many regions which are particularly affected, we don't have this data. So in order to make effective adaptation possible, you need to have those projections, and this is something we really need to get started on now.
Sanjay, please.
Thanks. I think I'll muddy the waters a little bit, since you said there should be a debate on all of this. Let me start with what Jen said and what John said, the whole issue of financing, where does the funds come from? See, the whole argument about climate finance and what we're talking about here in climate finance rests on I would call it a tautology. It's an argument which uses the primary hypothesis as the proof of the argument, which is actually wrong. The problem is that the whole question of building in climate resilience. Resilience, as Jen said, is a public good. Now, when we start talking about raising finance for something which is a public good, the problem arises, how do you price in climate risk? Investment, getting in finance is about pricing risk. Now, the moment you get into the issue of saying, how do you de-risk a project, an adaptation project, or even say a mitigation project, in a situation where, in the first panel of this conference, this issue was raised, I think, by Ratan, that you are already in a situation where raising funds for infrastructure or any project, when you raise a fund in Africa, you anyway are paying 300 basis points higher. When you're raising a project in India, maybe you're paying 200 basis points higher than you would be doing in a developed country. And this is without pricing in climate risk. The moment you price in climate risk, what happens is that your cost of borrowing increases dramatically. Now, the most vulnerable to climate are the poorest. The only access, and they are the ones who are actually responding day by day to the fact of drought, to the fact of hurricanes, to whatever is happening around in the world. The only access they have to finance is perhaps if they have access. Most of them don't have access. They probably use their own savings or whatever it is to adapt to it. The ones who have access are the easiest method they have is of self-help groups. And data, when you start looking at self-help groups, when you look at the problem financing, when you start looking at self-help groups, through government subsidies, yes, there is a 12% limit on what kind of interest is going to be charged. 12% is high, by the way. When you start to get into the market pricing mechanisms, your interest costs rise as high as 20%. That is what microfinance institutions actually charge to lend funds to the most vulnerable. So this whole question of pricing and climate risk rests on a tautology. So the argument then is what should be done. When you start talking about green bonds, when you start talking about InvITs, when you start talking various kinds of instruments which should be used to price in, to kind of lower the cost of finance, it comes as someone ultimately has to pay the bill. You can be ambitious only to the certain extent as to who is footing the bill of lowering the costs for the ultimate borrower. And that again puts a ceiling on how much money is going to be raised. And how are you really going to tackle a problem where today, the UNEP report 2016, if you look at the numbers, is talking about 180 to 200 billion per year in developing countries. And these are very off-the-cuff figures. The cost may actually be much higher. You're putting in global costs, the figure rises to $500 billion a year and keeps on rising year by year. So there is nothing on the table which actually adds up to those numbers. Now, that is the big challenge which you're going to face when you start talking about adaptation finance.
Thank you. I think that's really good, getting some heat into the discussion, some direction. I'm going to look at 2 or 3 things that are coming out, and I want to zero in. One, of course, you mentioned, Sanjay, the whole issue of financing. There's one data I want to just give. You mentioned number of variations. Data is incomplete generally, but cited estimates the cost of adaptation in developing countries will be between 140 to 300 billion per year, and then up to 500 billion by 2050.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, only 23% of public finance, climate finance, was targeted at adaptation. So Jan, your point that mitigation is really getting the larger share. But I do want to, on this point, let's get into the economy and finance of it. And then, Kira, I'm very keen to go into the science and knowledge of it in the sort of subsequent discussion. John, I wanted to bring you in on the sort of green bonds and the practicality of it. How do you see to what Sanjay is posing, the point about public good and who finances and who fits the bill? What do you see? What's your response?
Actually, you see, the finance is a broad of any development, basing on World Bank looking forward. That's it, 2030, the 10 years to come. You see a lot of requests from public funding. The government needs more funds. As I mentioned, the public sector is more, funding the infrastructure, agriculture. But when it comes for the climate change, the actions, and the loss is big, it's huge. Whatever you do, you would have a very good road network. You would have a very good agriculture irrigation project. But if you don't really go for smart, resilient projects, so the flooding would come and then the road will go. So it's good actually if the governments and the public sector would collaborate with the private sector. They come up with the proposal to sustain our development. So with the World Bank approaches, as I mentioned, forward-looking, the initiatives now, the new innovative approach, new financial instrument, those are proposed solutions. Those are proposed, would we have adoption? Of course, mitigation is also considered. But you would see in the future, we need more funding. That's why I mentioned for Africa as the target. If I would also recall the March One Planet Summit, the potential funding was 22.5 billion USD for Africa for the climate action. Those are potential funding. But how do we use the money? How do we allocate strategically, efficiently to the key sectors to make sure we deal with the resilient project? How would public-private sector collaborate, work together? That's why in the World Bank approach, what they do, it's more basing, of course, of research to inform policymakers. This would be one of the solutions. How would you prioritize? You would have many priorities. How would you make sure you have top priorities among the priorities, and then you make sure you're really resilient, your projects? From Africa, as I mentioned, regional economic bloc, and then East African. Case of Rwanda and Kenya were selected as case studies, and then after they would have scale up for the other countries. The case of Rwanda now, if I was the home, the initiative happening now, the government set the green funds under the Ministry of Environment. When you compare to the continental level, FONERWA is one of the largest in Africa, the functional funds, which is now mobilizing more funds using the green approach. One of the World Bank projects on deep dive, that's on green, supporting the FONERWA to come up with a strong mobilization strategy, considering the new financial instrument, where I mentioned resilience bonds, green bond, then they decentralize to the local government, municipal bond, which would help the public funds to alleviate, to support, and to leverage more funding for the climate change. Of course, when you see the implementation of Paris Agreement, 2015, NDC were one of the implementation. The engagement to implement NDC from Paris Agreement, we have to really bring it from global to the local level. The action should be taken from top to down. We need to support those farmers at the local level. We need to support the women and the youth at the local level. How do we deep dive to support the NDC implementation? So the case of Rwanda, if I get the practical cases now, we, as a country, support 4 sectors. Among the sectors, we suggest actually as part agriculture. Majority of Rwandese in Africa, more than 80% of the population in Africa, they are in agriculture. More than maybe 50% of the Africans, they are not connected to the access to the electricity. So we need to support those key sectors from agriculture, energy, transport, and then health. those are the initiative. So the creation of the new launch or coalition of the Minister of Finance is to make sure the climate change action are really considered in the national planning. Whatever you do, you make sure you prioritize it.
Sure,
Thank you.
Other views? Is it only about finance, or could you do things differently? I saw Kira, you wanted to come in, and
Yeah.
then maybe Jan, and then Jayant, if you have comments. So let's
Yeah.
take it in this flow.
I mean, I completely agree. So what you said, actually, I mean, mitigation adaptation will not be for free. For example, if we look here, also making this building fire safe was not for free, right? So of course it will cost something, and I think it's very important to highlight this, that there will be some costs which will have to be borne out of also public money. But what I would like to highlight, and maybe shift the focus a little bit, is not only talking about climate risk, but also the risk of on the financial side. So the risk of stranded assets, for example, which is true both for mitigation, so for infrastructure, which we build for fossil fuels, but it's also true for adaptation. So if you don't calculate in the climate risk and the climate projections, you can make infrastructure which seems resilient now very exposed and very not resilient in the future. So one example is that of cyclone shelters in Philippines, which were built in zones which were inundated during Cyclone Haiyan. Why was this? Because of sea level rise and because of the magnitude of the storm. So areas which had previously never been flooded were completely flooded, and people died in those cyclone shelters. They drowned. So this is just to illustrate how important it is to really take into account the future projections of climate change. But then maybe again shifting, because we don't want to paint a too dark picture, right? Because we can have, especially for those who are most vulnerable, solutions which are bankable. So, for example, if you look at the agricultural sector, using digitalization can serve farmers to become more independent from large agricultural corporations. If you use modern technology to monitor the fields, you can decrease fertilizer use, you can decrease pesticide use. And if you use apps to deliver information to farmers, maybe smartphone apps or SMS services, including, for example, when to sow, when to use fertilizer, etc., you can make farming much more efficient. And why is this important? Not because farmers are not able, but because, as I mentioned, we are living in a different climate now, and traditional knowledge of subsistence farmers often does not apply anymore in these settings. So this is why such solutions, maybe bringing modern technology together with indigenous knowledge, can be really beneficial, both in terms of building resilience, but also in terms of financial benefits. So I think we should really try to reap those solutions while not maybe forgetting that there are larger funding gaps out there which need to be addressed. But they shouldn't sort of keep us away, keep us stagnating in this helplessness.
Thank you, Kira. That's really good. I mean, it's intersecting finance and other issues. Jan, you had some thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I want to build off of what others have already said and point out that it will cost something to adopt. There's no question, and infrastructure is a good example. But it also depends on compared to what. I mean, compared to inaction is the most cost-effective solution. I think what we have seen is that Africa in particular is hugely exposed and vulnerable to climate change. And that, for example, Cyclone Idai, which hit earlier this year, affected over 3 million people in the region. 3 million people. It was catastrophic. And it destroyed as much as half of Mozambique's crops and critical infrastructure, perhaps for a decade or more. And so it left the communities affected, but also the the supporting communities internationally scrambling for what to do now post-disaster. And if we can prepare for more and more severe disasters, it will be very cost-effective investment today. What we know from the literature is that African nations vulnerable to extreme climate change, and some of the numbers I have, is in the hundreds, almost up to $1 trillion in 2023. Those are numbers, 1.4 trillion is the projection in 2023 in Africa. That's what I'm talking about. It's not about hundreds of billions, which we need to spend to protect ourselves. So in Africa, it's imperative to act today. How do we do that? What we know is that African countries are already spending, the numbers I have from a 2017 ECA report, ECA, 2 to 9% of GDP already being spent today on adaptation-relevant activities in Africa. We just have to do better. We have to do more, and we have to do better. The costs of adapting will be large, but there's also, in my view, in my humble opinion, having looked at this in some really specific cases, including in India, for example, we did a case study in Mumbai some years ago looking at flood risk. There is some low-hanging fruit where governments, public sector quite often is investing heavily in infrastructure locally. They just have to do it differently. They have to take into account the kinds of climate projections that Kira is referring to, and do it differently. It might mean that they build in different locations, as we heard from the example she mentioned on cyclone shelters. It might be that they use different materials in the case of energy efficient and heat resistant buildings, or orient the buildings in a different way so they have less exposure to the extreme heat of sun in extreme heat periods. Those kinds of design mechanisms are really essential. And it comes down to important detail of how we train and who we train, including having this issue taken up in a serious way by professional associations such as the engineers of the world, the architects of the world, and the public sector planners of the world, so that they understand that they are working in a future, with a future that is not going to resemble the past. And that's where the climate projections and investing in science and knowledge centers that are regional, that are locally accessible, and provide usable climate projections, usable knowledge for local decision makers.
Great. I think we are going towards the science and knowledge sort of strand, which I want to pick up. But I did want to ask you, Jayant, did you have more thoughts on building on your externality point, which I thought was very, very important and strong?
You know, there is a phrase that more things change, more they remain the same. I have, in 2014, before the Paris Agreement was agreed, the African group made certain submissions. And they talked about adequacy, predictability, equitable distribution, and they said public finance has to be the main source. And they were not talking only of adaptation finance, they were talking of both mitigation and adaptation. Now the way the discourse is going, that how do we get the private finance in? So what I have done is, I'll not say how it has happened, let's not point fingers. Now the victim is asked, you must get the private finance. No, that's something wonderful or astounding. Green Climate Fund, in 2009 we were promised that by 2020, $100 billion per year will be the flow from private and public finance per year. And Green Climate Fund today has corpus of about $10 billion, and they have disbursed. I'm not talking of annual disbursal. Cumulative disbursal is about $4 or $5 billion. So where are we? Now, Kulisa talked about an NDC. I saw Rwanda as NDC. I saw some African countries NDCs. Now, when were they submitted? They were submitted even before they knew what Paris Agreement was going to contain. As a mutual reassurance, EU said, put on the table what is your contribution. And 5 years have gone by, and I saw Rwanda's NDC is quite detailed. it's comparatively smaller country and they did lots of work. They have virtually quantified scheme by scheme. I don't know how much money has actually flown down to them. To my mind, unless the public finance, and this public finance has to come from developed countries, they have to take the lead role. Now, unless public finance starts flowing, and I don't say that $100 billion should come from public finance, they have to play a catalytical role. You do interest subsidy, you give sovereign guarantees, and we have been doing all this in promoting trade. Exim banks, when they were set up, US Exim Bank, how much trade promotion they did, they must have innumerable papers. Why can't we have a climate change bank of this promotional nature? Green Climate Fund, if you go through their minutes, they sit on it. I mean, World Bank is faster, please don't mind. World Bank is faster. Green Climate Fund splits, not only they split hairs, they split the splitted parts of the hairs. And $5 billion in last, 10 years? Is that a joke? So I'm not pessimistic, I'm optimistic. And my optimism lies just PIK, Potsdam Institute of Climatology. See, we should not only focus on extreme climate events. Sahelian drought, drying of Lake Chad. Now, these are events which are multi-decadal, multi-year, and climate change need not hit in one big cyclone in Mozambique. It will hit slowly. And if it is going to hit slowly, we have time. We have time to put our act together and get into it together. From 1st January 2021, the NDCs are going to roll out, the implementation is going to start. I'm sure about Rwanda, South Africa, I know the negotiators, India, I know. We are going to do whatever we can from our own resources to implement the NDC. Question is, what is the rest of the world, the developed world, going to do? And that's for something, there's a fog in front of my eyes. I don't know what they're going to do.
Thank you, Jayant. You must have been a tough negotiator. I want to come to Sanjay on this point, then I want to turn to audience. But Sanjay, I want to come to you with a specific question, just to make it a bit more practical. You know, we heard in the last 2 days that bankable projects, regarding that the banks don't finance projects. Projects have to come to them. So there is an intermediary between those who have lost their homes, and as Jayant says, you know, for example, in the Odisha cyclone in India, we now know 500,000 houses have to be constructed, or 100,000 houses have to be constructed in Mozambique. How will that happen, Sanjay? What do you think? What role state and the banks or the communities have to play? What's your take on that?
See, eventually it is about building proper models for risk sharing. And that is somewhere where we are severely lacking at the international level. And that's beside the point which Jayant was trying to make. Now, what we keep talking about private-public partnerships. Actually, in the last 20 years, private-public partnership models have died. They're dead. It's a kind of model which has not worked anywhere in delivering infrastructure, in delivering, forget climate adaptation and climate mitigation projects, in delivering hardcore infrastructure projects anywhere in the developed world. Now, what went wrong there? What went wrong there was precisely the questions which we need to answer if we are going to tackle this question. What went wrong there was that you cannot always pass all the risk to the private party. You have to have adequate risk-sharing arrangements. The problem is that if you have adequate risk-sharing arrangements, the next problem comes, how do you segregate genuine projects from not so genuine projects? How do you build in the proper hybrid risk-sharing models, which, by the way of guarantees, interest credits, guaranteed returns, annuity models, annual annuity models, there are lots of models which can be experimented with. And this is going to be a hard work in progress. But ultimately, the answer is going to be, if you're talking of bankable projects, yes, people will have to go to banks because assessment of credit is an important part. And that is where risk sharing comes in. The problem is that no one is willing to take, the public sector wants to pass on all the risk to the private sector raises its hand, says we can't do it, they will not come into these projects, and then you have a whole host of non-performing assets piling up one after the other. And that's a story all over Africa, that's a story in many parts of India, where these kinds of projects have been created. So there is a role for all of these.
Thank you, Sanjay. I know, let me just check if the audience has questions, because we are down to 18 minutes Then I'm sure we'll come back to you, Kira and Jan. Can I check with the audience? Are you itching to go with some difficult questions for our panelists? So I'll take 3. So I got you there, Mahua. Can I see any other hand? There you are at the mic. Mahua, can you get to the mic? While you please start, and if anybody else, you've also got a question?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so I'll start with the left, then you, and then Mahua. Thank you very much. Please go ahead. Introduce yourself very quickly and ask the question.
Okay, thank you. My name is Busola Ajibola. I work with the Federal Ministry of Environment, and I'm from Nigeria. I just wanted to ask, I know that addressing climate change is urgent at this time, and I know that vulnerable communities are really suffering. Is there a way to attract private investors to have projects that can deal with vulnerability, adaptation in these communities? Like, is there like a cost benefit for them? Something to bring them down? Because the truth is, these vulnerable communities are suffering. Most of them cannot be in this kind of forum. So you don't really know what they're going through. And the truth is, the government is trying, but they don't have enough funding to address most of these issues. So is there a way we can attract private investors to have, even if it's just capacity building, trainings, or strategies to help these communities cope with the impacts of climate change?
Thank you. Wonderful question. I thought that was a fundamental one. We'll come back to you, so please note the questions and we'll take in a bunch of 3. Please go ahead.
All right, I will just go forward from where my sister from Nigeria actually stopped. My name is Peace Chikodnaka Eze. I'm a broadcast journalist from Nigeria. Yesterday, we had a session on green growth and development, and today we are talking about climate resilience, how we can make, how agricultural development banks can make climate resilient. And then I have 2 questions. How can we come up with a workable method of resolving these issues emanating from the climate change? The issues around the Lake Chad Basin, that is the ecological and the humanitarian crisis around the Lake Chad Basin, is no longer news. And every year we see the displacement of people and the poverty brewing in that region or in the West African region. Then secondly, we can talk about climate resilience without talking about the media. The media remains a fundamental tool to spread our message across to those who are in communities, local communities. And when I talk about the media, I am not just talking about the social media. I am talking about the traditional media platforms. Because many of those people at the rural communities or at the local level do not have access to power, like I said yesterday, and also have no access to internet. But when you look at all of these issues, one of the things that remains fundamental is the fact that there is lack of synergy between the development banks and the media organization, as well as expert organizations and the media organization. And the issue of budgetary is a fundamental issue. And I don't know how we can address this if we would, achieve some of the SDG goals.
Thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks. I'd like to congratulate the moderator and the panelists for some really important insights that you're sharing. I have a quick comment and then a question. The comment is on capacity building. I think we need to peel the onion one layer deeper, and just say that, look, the capacity building begins right in the government institutions, which are spending all these public funds right now in order to achieve the NDCs, as Mr. Mosker was saying. We have seen and studied that a lot of the people who are in director-level positions in these public institutions and the people who work below them really don't have the adequate training and background. So who else are you going to train? All of these other capacity building needs that we talked about, let's begin right in the government institutions themselves, so that people who are already spending money for housing or for building roads or whatever they do as part of their daily business, using the government budget, let's sensitize them to being climate resilient. What does it mean? How can I change my design and incorporate climate resilience. So I think the capacity building issue is it's a root sort of issue, and we are dancing around it. My question is, about 10 years ago...
Please keep it short, otherwise we will not have time for answers.
Yes, the results-based financing was, I think, adopted by some development banks. What do you think of this? What is your experience in terms of addressing the question that you had with how do we attract private sector finance? They need to find bridging money, and they are assured that once the results are on the ground, they will be reimbursed by sovereign parties. What is your experience with this? Because there are mixed views on results-based finance as a tool. Thank you.
Great set of questions. Good, I'm not a speaker today. So how do we do this? Do you want to just pick an answer? I think they're quite a big range, so maybe we'll just start with you, Kira, and then we'll see whoever wants to respond. You want to go next, then John, then Sanjay, then we come back to you, Jan. So Kira, please.
Yeah, maybe I can give sort of an indirect answer. I think one of the indirect questions of these points that were raised around devastation of communities and how to bring money in there is that how can we protect dignity in a changing climate? And is dignity actually bankable? I think it is actually. It may sound a bit weird, but I think it is bankable because I believe that humans want to be good. So, for example, I think that like self-tracking apps, which are now served to improve your health, for example, improve your sleeping patterns, could be used to improve people's carbon footprints and to support products which support communities. And through the internet, we can potentially connect communities in the future more directly with consumers in countries where the purchasing power is higher. And I completely agree with what was said earlier, that the global elites have to pay. I mean, this is not the question. The protection of the dignity in a changing climate will have to come from the current elites. So it's a lot about how to bring finances into communities which are vulnerable. And I think the problem is not that we don't have enough money in the global economy. It's completely an allocation problem. There's a lot of money, and I think what was raised earlier also was that we may not have capacity in those communities to propose even projects. So capacity building to propose projects through certain funders have to be done. And I think the point on the media is very important, that we should also try to get information out through also traditional media channels like radio, which is still widely used by subsistence farmers, for example.
I'm happy to go next. Yeah, so I did want to start with a point on capacity building, even though I know it wasn't really a question, but a statement. And I wanted to say that's just a rampant problem, and it needs much more attention in government, in the private sector, though I'm less worried about the private sector because they have money to spend on it. They have resources to get some of the best data that's available. Even if we don't have enough good data today, they'll have the best. But the public sector won't necessarily. And even if the public sector staff have the data, they won't necessarily know how to use it, so they need training. But more than that, I would also say, I've worked for some years with the donor community while I was at OECD. The donor agencies need to unpack and repack themselves around these questions. They have field offices that don't understand what climate change is, how it will affect their projects. As we've heard, many projects can be affected by climate change, by extremes and slow changes. So we need to screen all investment decisions, all public sector decisions for the impact for climate change. But to do that, we need technical expertise, and there's not enough of that. We can invest in local centers and local universities. There can be public-private partnerships. I'm not using that in the technical contractual sense, but often local or big companies will invest in knowledge centers to help promote resilience if you show them the reasons why it matters to having a high functioning and a more profitable business. That case can be made. It has been made. But there aren't enough examples of good practice where we've actually invested in this, in local centers of resilience, expertise, and excellence. I did want to say one of the questions about getting private investors into building resilience. How do we do that at community level? And there are a couple of good examples, and I think Kira has raised one, but in particular on the agriculture sector, there's some good research that really shows that half of the economically active women in the world work in the agriculture sector, and that that's a sector we know is already on the front end of climate impacts. So if you can get more resources and more, both technical and financial, and here it joins up with some of the conversations we've had here on financial inclusion, if we can get those resources to women farmers, we could feed more than 150 million additional people in this world. That's research from Drawdown and FAO. So, and we know this, but are we investing in it today? So the kinds of solutions that Kira is raising could be really important, and the private sector is central to delivering those, both in the financial sector, but also new tech.
Thank you. John?
Well, actually, I would summarize within 3 questions. The one, attracting the private sector, and then having a coordinated efforts between the public officials from the government side to the private sector in implementation. And then it came with the proposal and the practical cases happening in Rwanda in renewable energy. Well, the question, public funding are more available than private sector when it comes for climate action, but it's not enough. And then the World Bank is always leveraging the other source of funding from the public sector to the private sector. I mentioned about the launch of finance ministers in climate action through fiscal policy and public finance. This is one of the solutions. How would you bring together from the public sector and the private sector, and then you align planning and budgeting? Because one of the challenges, there is disconnection between the budgeting and planning in climate change action. You will see the people in land or in forest, they could suffer having limited funds. The people in the Ministry of Finance would be prioritizing agriculture and infrastructure. There is now cohesion coming up. You bring the Ministry of Finance always to have the budget and they allocate it according to the climate resilient project. That's number one of the solution. Second, when it comes leveraging the private sector, most of the private sector, they are profit-driven people. They couldn't go invest where they are not sure if they'll get quick return. So one of the approach from the public, it's all bank using the International Development Agency, and then work with the IFC in the private sector. They mobilize more funds from public, and then they get some money for the private sector attraction. I give the case what's happening in energy. One of the renewable energy in the country, like the case of East African, Ethiopia and Rwanda were selected. Actually, Ethiopia got like 500 million for climate action, coming if demonstrated cases and then implementation for scale-up. The case of Rwanda, 27 million were allocated to the improving cook stores, which would reduce the pollution and then would really support clean cooking. It's one of the challenges if it's more than 80%, 82%, they use fire, wood, and charcoal. This is one of the contributions to climate change issues. And then if we would shift from using fire, wood, and charcoal to the green cooking. This is one of the approach actually. The private sector operators came in, they get some support from the bank, and then the private sector would be really partner with the government on public sector investment. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's get to final responses. Sanjay, would you like to go first?
Yeah. Let me respond
Jan,
quickly to the 2 points which were raised on the issue of climate vulnerability, climate adaptability, and climate resilience. And I'll talk about in the context of a time when I would say that the UNFCCC made all these things sexy, these terms sexy. But let us go back to a time, and it's a big story. It's a story of optimism when you start looking at public funding and resilience. and adaptation. You know, between 1770 and 1943, India went through a few dozen famines. The biggest being the Bengal famine of 1770, which killed 10 million people, more than the Black Death killed in Europe. The last took place in 1943, which again killed 3 million people. Post-1947 in India, there have been droughts. There have been extremely severe droughts, but none of them ever qualified as a famine because there were no deaths. What happened? There was public sector intervention. Public sector intervention to actually create that kind of resilience, to create that kind of adaptability. Food security became a primary program of the government under a very, very interventionist central planning model. And food security became priority number one. And this happened at a time when, remember, in partition, India actually lost 50%, 85% of the population it got, 50% of the arable area, the irrigated area came to India's share. So situation should actually have got worse. It actually got better. It improved. Lots of interventions happened. You know, credit flows increased, public sector intervened. So interventions by the public sector can do a dramatic lot to build in resilience. And you today have a country of 1.3 billion people, which today, yes, faces drought. Farmers do face drought. Every year there's a drought. But you've not had a single famine in India.
That's a great point, Sanjay, on the effectiveness of the public sector. Jayantji, please, last few words on the questions, if you want to answer or comment.
I have three things to say. First is media. Media should hold the feet of powerful to the fire, whether in their own country or internationally. They shouldn't do cut and paste of what AP or writers send it to them through social media on the sky is falling down or Russians are coming or something. Second is, adaptation is going to happen because it concerns the people. Whether private finance will come or not, whether World Bank will finance or not, whatever resources are available within the country will be used for adaptation. We always say adaptation is local, and it is not regional, it is local, means really local. So that is going to take place. I only hope that the countries are not asked during international negotiations or otherwise that what are you going to do about mitigation? Because if funds don't come, international funds don't come for adaptation, then each country will spend its own money for adaptation, and that's how it is. My third comment is optimistic. The optimism is, and Kira will support me, there are lots of unknowables about how the climate change impacts are going to roll out. It's one thing to say that each cyclone which takes place is due to climate change. It's not. And partly yes, partly no. So as an Indian, I believe in higher divinity or God. If the unrolling of climate change is slower than what the climate models project, if we get 5 to 10 years more, then we'll lick the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. I think we got a great summary of the panel discussion. I really think the tagline should be "Dignity is bankable." That public sector could be effective, but is not enough. Public-private partnerships is the key and is difficult, and new knowledge and science is much needed to get to the crisis point, the slow onset, that actually transform into the crisis that we have and people understand it. Great panel. Thank you very much. Hope we generated some heat.
Thank you, Jaydeep.